October 6, 1944. A replacement depot outside Verdun, 0515 hours. A sergeant put a pry bar under the lid of a wooden weapons crate and leaned his weight into it. The nails screamed, the lid split, and the first rifle came out of the straw wrapped in old grease paper. Nobody cheered. Nobody reached for it. The sergeant held it in both hands, stared at the long bolt handle, and said the only thing a trained infantryman could say. What year is this supposed to be? Because the weapon in his hands was not the rifle those men had trained with. It was not the rifle stacked in neat rows 20 yards away behind the depot fence. It was an M1917 Enfield, a bolt-action rifle from another war. In 6 hours, those men were scheduled to move toward a German line built around MG-42s, mortars, and machine pistols. One side could fill a hedgerow with fire. The other side had just been handed antiques, and every man standing in that rain knew the difference was not paperwork. It was survival. Their commander was Captain Isaiah Mercer. He was 32 years old, a black infantry officer from Savannah, Georgia, the son of a dock worker and a seamstress, a man who had spent his adult life learning how systems hide insult inside procedure. He knew what unequal treatment looked like when it wore a smile. He knew what it looked like when it held a clipboard, and at that depot outside Verdun, it wore both. Mercer did not arrive looking for a fight with his own army. He arrived responsible for 319 men. Men who had trained on the M1 Garand, men who could reload by sound, men who had run night courses until their palms blistered around the same rifle they had been told would carry them through France. Now a quartermaster sergeant was checking their names against a second ledger, not the main ledger, the second one, the one with a blue slash across the cover. Mercer saw the two inventories before anyone explained them. Line A, combat standard rifles, M1 Garands, fresh barrels, clean magazines, issued to white infantry replacements moving east that morning. Line B, reserve small arms, salvaged Enfields, mixed lots limited clips, assigned to what the depot clerk called, without looking up, colored rifle companies. Mercer stood in the rain and looked from one line of crates to the other, 30 yards apart. Two armies in the same uniform. One equipped to fight the next war, one equipped to die in the last one. The officer in charge of the weapons bay was Lieutenant Harold Pike. Pike was 36, from Scranton, Pennsylvania, an ordnance officer with a polished helmet liner, clean gloves, and a desk so orderly it looked untouched by the war around it. He had spent 2 months turning shortage into doctrine. The excuse was simple. The advance across France had outrun the supply system. Fuel was late. Ammunition was counted by the box. Replacement weapons were arriving in broken waves from ports still jammed with trucks and ration crates. That part was true. But truth can be used as camouflage. There really was a shortage. There was also a choice, and Pike had made that choice visible in ink. Mercer entered Pike's office at 054. He did not slam the door. He did not raise his voice. He placed one Enfield on the desk between them. "My men are deploying as rifle infantry," Mercer said. "They require standard infantry weapons." Pike looked at the rifle as if Mercer had brought him a weather complaint. "The issue meets reserve allocation standards. Reserve standards do not change what the enemy carries." Pike folded his hands. "Captain, every unit in this theater is dealing with shortage." Mercer turned his head toward the window. Outside, white replacements were drawing Garands from a crate marked combat priority. He looked back. "My men are not receiving shortage. They are receiving classification." That was the first moment Pike's face changed. Not fear, not shame, irritation. The irritation of a man whose private rule had been named out loud. He told Mercer the Enfields were adequate. He said the decision came from theater allocation tables. He said the word policy twice. Then he said, "Your company is not authorized to draw from Line A." Mercer asked for the order in writing. Pike refused. Mercer asked him to sign the issue sheet personally. Pike refused again. So Mercer picked up the Enfield, turned and walked out. Not toward the trucks, not toward his men. Toward the field telephone. At 0559, Captain Isaiah Mercer bypassed the local depot chain. He sent a report to Army Logistics Command and copied the Corps Operations Desk. It was short, specific, dangerous. He named the depot. He named Pike. He named the two-ledger system. He listed the rifles being denied. He listed the weapons issued to white replacements in the same yard. Then he wrote the sentence that made the report impossible to bury. "Combat readiness is being degraded by racial allocation, not by supply scarcity." That line moved faster than the trucks. By 0646, it had reached a headquarters where men were already furious about anything that slowed the eastward push. By 0718, a senior staff colonel was in a jeep with 2 military policemen, and a driver told not to worry about the speed limit. The Jeep entered the Verdun depot at 0741. It did not stop at the guard shack. It rolled straight into the loading yard, threw mud across the crates, and braked hard enough that every clerk in the bay turned around. The colonel's name was Nathaniel Horn. He was not famous outside the army. That made him more dangerous inside it. He ran logistics like a man who believed delay killed as surely as artillery. And when he stepped out of that Jeep, he carried Mercer's report folded once in his left hand. He did not ask for a tour. He walked into Pike's office, the door closed. For almost 4 minutes, the yard heard nothing except rain, engines, and men pretending not to listen. Then the door opened. Pike came out first. His face was pale. Horn came out behind him and pointed at the files. "Bring them." 2 MPs removed the ledger books from Pike's shelves and dropped them on a packing crate in the center of the yard. Horn opened the blue/ledger where every man could see it. Line after line, unit after unit. Modern weapons routed one way, obsolete weapons routed another. Not because of mission, not because of urgency, because of the color of the men receiving them. Horn turned one page, then another. Then he looked at Pike and said, "This is not inventory management." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. He ordered the line B crates closed. He ordered the line A crates opened, and in front of the whole depot, 319 black soldiers handed back the rifles from the last war and received the rifle of the war they were actually fighting. M1 Garants came out of the straw, one after another, rifle by rifle, clip by clip, sling by sling. Men checked bolts, checked sights, checked chambers. No one celebrated loudly. That would have made it smaller than it was. They simply took the weapons they had already earned and held them like a fact finally corrected. When the last garand was issued, Horn picked up one of the Enfields from the closed pile. He held it long enough for Pike to look at it. Then he dropped it into the mud at his feet. "Do not hand yesterday's war to men fighting tomorrow's battle," he said. Then he turned, climbed back into the Jeep, and left the yard exactly as fast as he had entered it. The whole thing had taken less than 20 minutes. But 20 minutes can change the shape of a battlefield. By noon, Mercer's company was moving east. By nightfall, they were attached to a sector no one wanted. And by dawn, they would learn that winning the first fight against the system did not mean the system was finished with them. The sector commander was Colonel Augustus Brackett, 50 years old, regular Army, Missouri-born, a man who had built his career on never appearing emotional about anything. Brackett had already read the depot incident report. He understood what had happened. He also understood that nobody had ordered him to admire it. The map on his table showed a shallow ridge near the village of Montreval, 2 miles of broken tree line, open beet fields to the west. A road cut below it. German movement confirmed beyond the far slope. The position mattered because it controlled the road. The problem was scale. A front that wide should have been held by a regiment. Brackett assigned it to Mercer's reinforced company. 319 men. Mercer entered Brackett's command post at 20:30 hours. He had the map in his hand. "Sir, this frontage cannot be held by one company against armored infantry." Brackett did not look up. "It will be held until relieved. Relief is not scheduled. Then you will hold longer." Mercer placed a finger on the ridge line. "If they push through here with half a battalion, they can fold both flanks. If they bring armor, we will be too thin to stop them before they reach the road." Brackett finally looked at him. "Captain, you have your rifles now." There it was, the sentence beneath the sentence. "You complained. You got what you wanted. Now let us see whether you were worth the trouble." Mercer held his eyes. "Rifles do not turn one company into a regiment." "No," Brackett said. "But discipline sometimes does." The meeting was over. Mercer stepped out into the cold and stood beside a blackout truck while rain tapped on the canvas. He did the arithmetic commanders hate. 2 miles, 319 men, a German force likely larger than his own. Artillery support routed through a command post that might take 10 minutes to approve a mission. 10 minutes was a lifetime. An MG-42 could change a tree line in 10 seconds. A mortar barrage could erase a platoon in 2 minutes. Mercer needed time he did not have, so he went looking for the only man in that sector who knew how to manufacture it. Lieutenant Daniel Cross was a field artillery liaison from Iowa, 29 years old, quiet, thin, always carrying a grease pencil behind his ear. He was the kind of officer other officers forgot until shells had to land exactly where they were needed. Cross had spent 6 weeks studying the Montreval sector. He knew which orchards hid German approach routes, which drainage ditches carried sound, which farm lanes looked useless until tanks used them at dawn. Mercer found him under a tarpaulin, marking a soaked map with a flashlight shielded under his coat. "I need first rounds under 4 minutes," Mercer said. Cross looked up. Across how much frontage? 2 miles. Cross stared at him for a long second. Then he looked at the map. Brackett gave you the ridge. Yes, with one company, yes. That is not a defensive order. I know. Cross capped the grease pencil. That is a receipt for casualties, Mercer said. Can you do it? Cross did not answer quickly. That was why Mercer trusted him. A fool says yes first and counts later. Cross counted first. If we pre-register the likely lanes tonight, and your observers use reference names instead of coordinates, and every platoon digs by those references instead of by the map, maybe 4 minutes. Maybe is not enough. Cross bent over the map. 3:40 if nobody panics on the radio. They won't. Brackett will not approve the ammunition. I am not asking Brackett for permission to keep my men alive. Cross looked at Mercer. Then he reached for the grease pencil. Show me where you are putting your left flank. They worked through the night. No speeches, no heroics, just men in wet wool doing the kind of work history rarely knows how to honor. Cross selected 16 target zones. The orchard lane, the road cut, the broken stone wall, the dead horse field, the drainage ditch, the shallow draw where armor would try to hide from observation. Mercer changed every platoon position to match the artillery plan, not roughly. Exactly, if a machine gun team dug 10 yards too far left, the fire mission would protect empty dirt. If a forward observer used the wrong word under stress, shells would fall behind the danger instead of on top of it. So they rehearsed, in whispers, in rain, in the dark. Observer red mill. Battery red mill confirmed. Observer shift 50 fire for effect. Battery shot. Again. By 0330, every platoon knew the reference names. By 0415, Cross had registered the most likely approaches using reduced charges and single ranging rounds hidden under routine harassing fire. By 0500, Mercer's men were in holes dug into the Montreval Ridge with garrons across their knees, old mud on their boots, new rifles in their hands, and a fire plan that existed mostly in memory. The Germans came at 062. They did not come screaming. That is not how experienced soldiers attack in the dark. They came as shapes moving behind the beat field. Steel helmets, low silhouettes. 2 assault guns nosing through the road cut with infantry spread behind them. The first American outpost saw them at 061. A forward observer pressed the handset to his ear and said, Red Mill, fire mission. Cross was already awake. He had been awake all night. His battery answered in seconds. Shot. The first rounds landed at 063 minutes and 42 seconds after the call. The shells did not stop the assault by themselves. Artillery rarely does. What they did was steal the Germans' timing. The lead assault gun halted. The infantry behind it split. The second vehicle angled into the orchard lane, exactly where Cross had expected it to go. Mercer's right flank opened fire. Not wild, not panicked. 8-round Garand clips controlled by men who had trained for months with a weapon they had almost been denied. The German line dropped at 180 yards. Another observer called stone wall. Cross shifted. The next salvo landed behind the assault, closing the exit. For 17 minutes, the ridge became mathematics under pressure. Fire, shift, hold, shift again. Mercer moved from hole to hole, crouched low, mud on his coat, counting ammunition, listening for panic. Finding none. At 0635, the German attack broke away. By 064, the field was still. Mercer's company had held. 5 wounded, no dead. When Colonel Brackett read the report, he did not believe it. He sent his operations officer to verify the casualty list. Then he sent him to verify the German wrecks. Then he called Cross and asked whether the response time was a clerical error. Cross said no. At 1100, Brackett called Mercer into the command post. He did not apologize. Men like Brackett rarely did. He said, explain your fire plan. So Mercer did. The reference names, the rehearsed calls, the pre-registered lanes, the exact placement of platoons by artillery geometry instead of by map habit. Brackett listened with his hands behind his back. When Mercer finished, the colonel looked down at the map. You built this last night? Yes, sir. Without my authorization? Yes, sir. It worked. Yes, sir. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the field telephone clicking on the table. Then Brackett said, have Lieutenant Cross write it down. I want the other battalions briefed before dark. That was all. Not an apology. Something more useful. An order built from evidence. For 6 days, the Montreval Ridge held. The Germans probed it twice. Both times, Cross's fire plan answered faster than they expected. A dawn movement into the orchard lane was broken in 4 minutes. A night infiltration along the drainage ditch was caught by flares and a pre-registered mortar box. A machine gun team that tried to settle behind the stone wall found the wall had a name in the American fire plan. The men began to trust the system because the system had earned it, not the army system, their system. Mercer's discipline, Cross's pencil, the platoon's memory, the rifle line that did not flinch. By the end of the week, Brackett's staff had a new phrase for the ridge. They called it the fast sector. The Germans had a different name for it. They called it the place where American artillery arrived too soon. But every method has a weak point. And the weak point in Mercer's system was not courage, it was paper. On October 13th, a runner from 2nd Platoon was hit near a culvert while carrying a small oilskin card. The card listed 6 emergency reference names and the rough relationship between them, not the whole plan. Enough. He was captured before nightfall. By midnight, German artillery officers had the card. By 0200, they understood what it meant. The Americans had shortened the time between sighting and impact by tying field positions to spoken reference points. If those reference points could be mapped, the ridge could be punished before Mercer could shift. At 23:15, Army intelligence passed the warning to Brackett. At 23:30, Brackett passed it to Mercer. At 23:32, Mercer found Cross. He did not ask whether the plan was compromised. He asked, how much of it can they use? Cross looked at the card copy under a red-lensed flashlight. Enough to hit the Orchard Lane, Stonewall, and Red Mill. Maybe the command post if they work backward. How long to build a new grid? 6 hours clean. How long do we have? Cross listened to the guns in the distance. Maybe 3. Mercer folded the card. Then we move in 3. What followed was the hardest kind of military work. Not the part that looks good in paintings. The part done while exhausted men curse under their breath and drag everything they own through wet dirt because the alternative is being buried in the hole they trusted yesterday. No written orders, no lanterns, no truck engines. Mercer moved the company by voice and by touch. 1st Platoon shifted 220 yards north into a fold behind the ridge. 2nd Platoon abandoned the orchard edge and dug into a beet field ditch. The machine guns moved off the obvious high ground. The aid station packed in 9 minutes and reopened in a cellar nobody had used because the roof looked unsafe. Cross rebuilt what he could. He threw away the names the Germans had captured and replaced them with farm objects only the Americans could see in the dark. Broken pump, white gate, 3 poplars, cold well. He did not have time to register everything. So he registered what would kill the most men if left uncovered. By 0348, Mercer's original command hole was empty. By 0441, the last machine gun team slid into its new position. At 0426, the German barrage opened. The first rounds landed exactly where Mercer's command post had been. The second group hit the old orchard line. The third walked across Stonewall. The barrage was accurate, professional, merciless. It destroyed holes with no men in them. Mercer lay in a new trench 260 yards from his old position and listened to the enemy spin shells on yesterday. One of his corporals whispered, "Captain, they're killing our ghosts." Mercer did not smile. He said, "Let them." The barrage lifted at 0441. That meant infantry was moving. At 0448, German troops entered the beet field in 2 waves. They had been told the American fire plan was broken. They had been told the ridge had been softened. They had been told they were walking into confusion. Instead, they walked into men who had spent their whole lives learning how to survive systems built to underestimate them. The first observer waited until the German line crossed the ditch. Then he called, "Broken pump." Cross answered, "Shot." First rounds landed at 0452, 4 minutes flat, slower than the first battle. Still too fast for the men advancing. The German line staggered. Mercer's left flank fired. A BR team cut into the gap between the first and second waves. The assault tried to bend toward the road cut. The road cut had a new name now. White Gate Cross shifted. This time the shells landed behind the attackers, not in front. The message was clear even if nobody said it. Forward was death, backward was also death. Standing still only made it easier to aim. At 0507, the German assault began to break. At 0519, it was over. Mercer's company had moved a defensive system in 3 hours, absorbed a pre-planned barrage, and held the ridge again. 7 wounded, 1 killed. The man killed was Private Leonard Hayes of Macon, Georgia. He had been one of the men standing in the depot rain, holding an infield he should never have been given. He lived long enough to receive the right rifle, long enough to fire it in the right fight, not long enough to see anyone write down why it mattered. That is the part official records rarely know how to carry. They carry the method. They carry the map symbols. They carry the ammunition expenditure. They carry the phrase, "successful defensive action." They do not always carry the men. By October 18th, the Montreval reference system had been briefed to 3 battalions. By October 24th, A Corps training memorandum described the technique as accelerated target referencing for forward infantry observers. It did not mention Mercer. It mentioned no company, no depot, no blue ledger, no rain, no infield dropped into the mud, but the method moved. Other units adopted reference names. Battery response times dropped. German attacks that depended on a long American delay became less reliable. A system built in one night by a black captain and a quiet artillery lieutenant began saving men who would never know either of their names. Colonel Brackett requested Mercer's company for the next defensive phase. Again, no apology. But the request was written into the operational order. That mattered. Because institutions can ignore a man in conversation more easily than they can ignore him in procedure. Mercer understood that. He had been fighting procedure since the depot. He knew the system would not become just because one colonel had been embarrassed or one ledger had been exposed. But he also knew something had been forced into the record. Proof, not argument, not pleading. Proof. After the war, Isaiah Mercer came home to Georgia with a citation for his company, a letter from Corps headquarters, and the same rank he had carried through the mud. The Army was shrinking. Promotions were scarce. That was the official explanation. The unofficial one had been with him his whole life. He signed his separation papers in 1946 and returned to Savannah. The uniform that had turned heads in France did not open the front door of restaurants in Georgia. The combat record that had convinced artillery officers did not convince school boards to pay black teachers the same as white ones. So Mercer became a teacher anyway. History, 7th and 8th grade. A segregated school with cracked windows and textbooks already stamped with another school's name. For 28 years he taught children how to read more than the words on a page. He taught them to ask who wrote the rule. Who benefited from it, who called it tradition, who called it policy, who hid a decision inside a ledger and hoped no one would turn the page. He rarely spoke about the depot. When students asked about the war, he would say, "War is mostly work interrupted by terror." Then he would return to the lesson. But every year, when he taught the Second World War, he wrote 2 weapons on the board, M1917 Enfield, M1 Garand. He would point to the first and say, "This is what someone thought was enough." Then he would point to the second and say, "This is what the job required." And then he would make the class sit with the space between those sentences. Lieutenant Daniel Cross stayed in uniform after the war. He entered the reserves, became an engineer, wrote 2 quiet letters in the 1950s, asking that Mercer's role in the Montreval method be formally added to the artillery training record. Both letters came back with polite language and no action. Colonel Brackett retired in 1952. He never publicly discussed Mercer's company. Lieutenant Pike, the depot officer, was removed from his post after the Verdun investigation and transferred to administrative duty far from the front. His blue ledger disappeared into an archive box with a number, a date, and no moral vocabulary at all. That is how institutions survive shame. They file it correctly. Mercer died in Savannah in 1984. His daughter Ruth found the folder while cleaning out the back room of his house. It was not hidden. That almost made it harder to understand. A plain manila folder. His company number written on the tab. Inside it, a carbon copy of the report he had filed from the depot telephone on October 6, 1944. The words were still clear. Combat readiness is being degraded by racial allocation, not by supply scarcity. Below that sentence in red pencil, someone had written a note, not a medal citation, not a public tribute, not an apology, just 12 words. They asked for standard arms. They were right. Issue without delay. Initials, N.H. Nathaniel Horn, the staff colonel from the Jeep, the man who had opened the blue ledger in the rain. Somehow the carbon copy had made its way back to Mercer. No one in the family knew when. No one knew why he never showed it to them. Maybe because proof is a strange burden. When you have lived too long without being believed, even the document that vindicates you can feel less like a trophy than a receipt for something that should never have been in dispute. The story of Isaiah Mercer is not only about rifles. The rifles matter. A bolt-action rifle against a machine gun war is not symbolism. It is a practical disadvantage measured in seconds and blood. But the deeper weapon in this story was the assumption behind the rifle. The assumption that some soldiers could be given less and still be expected to prove more. The assumption that capability had to be demonstrated by black soldiers before fairness could be considered, while others received fairness as a starting condition. Mercer defeated that assumption the only way the institution could not easily dismiss. He made it operationally expensive. At the depot, he proved discrimination was degrading combat readiness. On the ridge, He proved preparation and competence could transform a position everyone else had counted as expendable. When the enemy captured his system, he proved the system was never the paper. It was the men who understood why the paper worked. 319 men walked into the Verdun depot with rifles from another war. They walked out with the weapons they should have received in the first place. Most of them came home. One did not. And every method that grew from that ridge carried, whether it admitted it or not, the weight of the men who had to fight twice to be counted once. Once against the enemy in front of them. Once against the system behind them. That second battle rarely gets a monument, but it leaves evidence. Sometimes in a training memo with no names. Sometimes in a classroom lesson about 2 rifles. Sometimes in a manila folder, in red pencil, waiting for someone to understand that the most important line was never the signature. It was the sentence that forced the truth into the record. They were right, and they should never have had to prove it.